Proverbs chapter 4, keep and guard your heart. Everything flows from the heart. So if we were to get under the hood, what's the under the hood lie that tells us, that makes us believe that bitterness is productive?
Gosh, you ask the best questions.
Thanks.
I think bitterness at its core is the antithesis of hope. This is as good as it'll ever get, and therefore the only option I have is to rail against it. You know, if we are to be a people of hope, I would argue that we are all creatures of hope, whether we acknowledge it or not. Like that could, like even with my little kids, you know, maybe this isn't good parenting, but like with dinner, a lot of times if they're not wanting to eat, I'm like, hey, if you eat your dinner, I got this piece of pie for you. They're like, well, you better believe now they're eating that dinner because they have like this hope that they're like, you know, they're kind of holding out for. That's a lame analogy, but I just think when we lack this sort of like vision of what a flourishing future could look like, well, of course we're going to run to bitterness. You know, it's either bitterness or it's just our own fulfillment. I think when we lack purpose, we will distract with pleasure. And if it's not pleasure, then it is, well, I'll just be the Eeyore in the room. And that's how I kind of, you know, when you look at like focus groups and they're testing certain products, it can sometimes feel like, oh, I will differentiate myself from this group by being the first to complain about how this, you know, commercial didn't land with me or how this movie didn't hit the mark. Like as a culture, I feel like we almost celebrate and reward the loudest, most cynical voice in the room. And I think that's an old Andy Stanleyism, right? What's rewarded is repeated. If we reward the person who's the most upset or, you know, the loudest complainer, I mean, this is a little cheeseball, but like even when it comes at a personal level, I had a mentor whenever I get really angsty, specifically about a person, you know, I would kind of unload. I'd complain to him because he's a safe person to do that with. And then he would stop and say, have you prayed for this person half as much as you criticize them? And of course the answer is always no. And what he was ultimately, I think, getting at was your hope is migrated. And what prayer does is it reignites in a lot of ways. Prayer is not just simply about, oh, I'm trying to convince God to do something. Prayer changes the way I see the world. That's what it's done for me. This is why I'm such a proponent for it. Like it's not just out of duty or, oh, if I don't, then God won't. Prayer is like a cleaning of the lenses. Like, oh man, I have not been seeing clearly. And prayer is a way of sort of bringing some clarity. If we're a people of the resurrection, then maybe things break our hearts, but we don't stay there. But because we know because of the cross that suffering, grief, pain does not have the last word. We know that this is going somewhere. And when we lose that plot, of course we're going to land on bitterness, because what else do we have, you know?
Grief doesn't have the last word. Suffering doesn't have the last word, but that is predicated upon the cleaning of the lenses, so to speak.
Yes.
Keep and guard your heart. This is
That's
full
right.
circle, folks. So I would like to suggest then that the reflexive response to a lack of hope is bitterness that causes us to hide, which says, this is my lot in life. I only have bitterness. I want to go back to something you said. You said when we lack purpose, we distract with pleasure. So I think floating around right now in the conversation is this. What is the character quality that's missing in us? Where's the emotional immaturity? What would you label that as? What's that character quality or asset that's missing when we default to bitterness, cynicism, when we don't have the reflex or the steadfastness or the spiritual maturity to go to clean the lenses? What is that quality?
Wow. I think part of it has to do with resilience. I think that is the easier answer. You mentioned steadfastness, perseverance. Like, there are some beautiful passages in Scripture that tell us perseverance's rightful place in the sequence of suffering. We do not deal with suffering well.
No.
I mean,
why not?
Gosh, so many reasons. Like even think about. I hope this isn't irreverent, but I even think about, as a pastor, I've done so many funerals in my life as a part of the office of pastor, and what has always struck me as odd is, we dress the person up in their finest suit, and we put blush on their cheek, and the amount of times I've lost track how many times I've heard people say at a funeral, "Man, he looks so good." And my thought, I never say it, but my thought always is, should he? Like, is that the point? Like, that's not for him. That's for us. Like, he's not. We dress him up, put her in her finest dress because we don't know how to actually cross that bridge to sit with our grief. When I spent time in India, and like the Hindus have a completely different practice. There was one night I was staying in a hostel, and this was a bizarre encounter because the power went out in the night. So when I woke up, not even the fan was running. So I woke up, it's already 110 degrees. And what I didn't know was that over the night, the person staying in the hostel below me had passed. And part of what they do in the Hindu tradition is they will wail openly for days on end, like screaming and wailing, and the whole community will come around them to do that. I didn't know this. So that weird moment, like as you're waking where you're still kind of dreaming but a little bit awake. I feel that it's 110 in the room, and then all I hear like beneath me is screaming. And honestly, my first waking thought was, am I in hell? Like what? It was such a bizarre moment. And the person that ran the hostel was explaining to me, hey, just so you know, this will be the next few days, and here's why. And it just stood in such stark contrast to my previous experiences with funerals in the West. They just own it. And they say, hey, bring all of your grief, bring all of your tears. This person that we loved is no longer with us. This is how we express that. And I thought, boy, it's been a long time since I've seen that kind of open expression when it comes to grief. And I think it goes both ways. I think a lot of well-meaning people, like if you have a friend who's grieving, you've probably been on the receiving end of this. A well-meaning friend, they come over to your house and they just offer you a verse out of context or some kind of Christian truism or sanctimony. And I think what we know to be true is that presence far outweighs platitudes, but we have to fill the silence with like our jargon, mostly because I'm uncomfortable with your discomfort. And so I think with good intent, we try to offer these prescriptive words of encouragement when what we really need is someone to simply sit with us in our grief and to know like I'm not going to leave you alone. That's really, really difficult to do. For myself included, by the way. Like I am a talker by nature. If the room's too silent for too long, I feel this intrinsic need to like, oh, I should say something, or I should tell a joke to lighten the mood. That has more to do with my discomfort than theirs, which I think shows a symptom of a bigger problem.